Imagine this. It is the dead of winter. The year is 1776. The temperature has dropped so low that the river in front of you is packed with massive chunks of floating ice. The wind is howling so hard that it cuts through your thin, torn coat like a knife. Your boots, if you even have boots, are completely soaked. Some of the men standing beside you have no shoes at all. Their bare feet are wrapped in rags, and as they stand on the frozen riverbank, those rags are slowly turning red from the blood seeping through their cracked, frostbitten skin. You haven't eaten a proper meal in days. You haven't slept in what feels like weeks. And somewhere across this dark, freezing, ice-choked river is your enemy, a professional army, trained, rested, well-fed, and armed to the teeth. And your general, a tall, quiet, determined man on horseback, turns to look at all of you, and in a calm but steady voice says, "We are going across tonight." No one argues. No one runs. Because every single man standing on that riverbank knows this is the night that decides everything. Welcome to the historic America, and this is the story of the Battle of Trenton, the night march that saved the American Revolution. Before we get into that Christmas night on the Delaware River, before we talk about the crossing, the surprise attack, the frozen march, and the stunning victory, we need to go back. We need to understand how things got this desperate in the first place. Because what makes the Battle of Trenton so extraordinary is not just what happened that morning. It is everything that led up to it. The failures, the retreats, the humiliations, the collapse of hope. Because only when you understand how dark it truly was, can you understand how bright that one morning shone. The story begins not in 1776, but decades earlier, in the colonies that would one day become the United States of America. 13 colonies, stretching along the eastern coast of North America, were officially under the rule of the British Crown. The people who lived there were British subjects, technically. They paid taxes, they followed British laws, and they flew the British flag. But over time, something began to change. Something stirred in the hearts of the colonists. A feeling that they were being treated not as citizens, but as subjects. Not as equals, but as revenue sources. Not as human beings with rights, but as tools to be used and taxed and ignored. The British Parliament, sitting thousands of miles away in London, kept passing new laws, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, taxing everything from paper to tea to glass. And the colonists had no say in any of it. They had no representatives in Parliament. No voice, no vote. And so a phrase was born. A phrase that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. It wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a cry from the heart of people who felt invisible in the very system that governed them. Tension built for years. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters in Boston, killing 5 men in what became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, furious colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped an entire shipment of British tea into the water, the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsher laws. The colonists responded with more resistance. And then, in April 1775, on a cool spring morning in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, the first shots were fired. The American Revolution had officially begun. Now the colonies needed a leader. They needed someone to command this ragged, passionate, completely untrained collection of farmers and tradesmen that they were calling an army. The Second Continental Congress gathered and debated, and they chose a tall, quiet, unassuming Virginia planter named George Washington. Washington was 43 years old. He had served in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War, so he had some military experience, but nothing like what he was about to face. He had never commanded a force this large. He had never fought a full-scale war. And in a remarkable display of honesty that most politicians would never dare attempt, Washington told the Congress he wasn't sure he was the right man for the job. But he accepted the responsibility anyway. And that humility, that quiet, honest acknowledgement of his own limitations, would become one of his greatest strengths. What Washington inherited in the summer of 1775 was barely an army at all. It was a mixture of men from different colonies. Men who had never served together, who had different accents and different customs and different ideas about how things should be done. They had enthusiasm. They had passion. But they had almost no training, almost no discipline, almost no weapons, and almost no money. Washington knew this was going to be a long, brutal war. And he was right. In 1776, the British unleashed their full military might. General William Howe arrived in New York with one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever assembled, around 32,000 men. Well-trained, well-armed, supported by a powerful naval fleet commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. Washington had fewer than 20,000 men, and most of them were militia, civilians who had picked up guns and decided to fight for their country. Against the professional British Army, they didn't stand much of a chance in a direct fight. And that became painfully, brutally clear as 1776 wore on. August 1776, the Battle of Long Island. Washington's army was outmaneuvered and nearly surrounded. They barely escaped in a desperate nighttime retreat across the East River. September, the British took Manhattan, almost capturing Washington himself in the chaos. October, the Battle of White Plains. Another defeat. November 16, 1776. Fort Washington fell. 2,800 American soldiers were captured in a single day. It was one of the worst disasters of the entire war. Just days later, Fort Lee was abandoned as well. Washington's army was in full retreat, running, stumbling, staggering through New Jersey with the British Army pressing at their heels. 90% of the soldiers who had stood with Washington at Long Island were gone. Dead, captured, or deserted. What remained was a ghost of an army. Cold, hungry, exhausted, demoralized. And Washington himself, the man who had been chosen to lead this revolution, wrote a letter to his cousin back in Virginia. In that letter, he said, "I think the game is pretty near up." Read that again. The commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the man who would one day be the first president of the United States, was writing to his family and saying he thought the game was almost over. That is how bad it was. That is how close the American Revolution came to dying in the winter of 1776. The Continental Army finally crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December. The river, with its half-frozen waters and floating ice, was the only thing keeping the British from finishing what they had started. Washington used that geographic barrier to buy himself a little time, but only a little, because as December wore on, he faced a problem that was just as threatening as the British Army. Most of his soldiers' enlistments, their service contracts, were set to expire on December 31st. When the new year arrived, Washington might wake up to find that his army had literally disappeared overnight. Men going home to their farms, their families, their normal lives. And who could blame them? They had been fighting all year and losing. They had been cold and hungry and sick. They had watched their friends die and their country lose battle after battle. Why would they stay? And then, on December 19, 1776, just days before Christmas, a pamphlet arrived in camp. It had been written by Thomas Paine, a passionate writer and revolutionary who had become one of the most important voices of the American cause. The pamphlet was called The American Crisis, and it opened with one of the most powerful sentences ever written in the English language. "These are the times that try men's souls." Paine wrote about the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. Those men who are brave and enthusiastic when things are going well, but who shrink back when things get hard. He wrote about the men who were still standing, cold, hungry, defeated, and he called them something that no one had called them before. He called them the real heroes of the American story. Washington ordered the pamphlet read aloud to every regiment. And in the freezing December air, with the campfires barely keeping the cold at bay, those soldiers listened to those words, and something stirred inside them. A fire, a resolve, a refusal to quit. Washington needed that fire, because he was about to ask these men to do something that most soldiers, most sane human beings, would refuse to do. He was going to ask them to cross an ice-choked river in the dead of night, in the middle of a winter storm, and then march 9 miles through freezing darkness to attack a professional military force. And he wasn't going to frame it as a suggestion. He was going to frame it as the only option. Because for Washington, by this point, it truly was the only option. If he did nothing, the war was over. If he retreated further, the war was over. The only way forward, the only possible path to survival, was through. But before we talk about the crossing, we need to talk about the men on the other side of that river. The men Washington was planning to attack. Because understanding the Hessians, who they were, where they came from, why they were there, is essential to understanding everything that happened at Trenton. The Hessians were German soldiers, not British-German. They came primarily from two small German territories called Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau. Their rulers, petty princes sitting in small palaces, had struck deals with the British crown, essentially renting out their armies in exchange for enormous sums of money. It was a transaction that many found morally troubling even at the time. These men didn't choose to come to America. They didn't have a stake in the outcome of the American Revolution one way or the other. They were professional soldiers who went where they were sent. And they were sent to America. About 30,000 of them over the course of the war. They were disciplined. They were experienced. They were well-trained and well-equipped. And after their brutal effectiveness in the New York campaign, where they had helped crush Washington's army battle after battle, the name Hessian had become a word that made American soldiers genuinely afraid. Trenton, New Jersey, in December 1776 was a small town of about 100 houses, built along two main streets, King Street and Queen Street. It sat on the eastern bank of the Delaware River, which is why it mattered strategically. If the British could hold Trenton, they had a forward position on the river. And in Trenton, as of December 14th, there were approximately 1,400 to 1,500 Hessian soldiers garrisoned for the winter. Their commander was Colonel Johann Rall, a 50-year-old veteran who had been soldiering for 36 years. By all accounts, Rall was a brave man, bold, experienced, and completely confident in his abilities. Perhaps too confident, because Rall had one very significant weakness. He did not respect the American rebels at all. He thought they were untrained farmers playing at war. He thought they were incapable of anything resembling a serious military operation. And that contempt, that complete and total underestimation of his enemy, would cost him everything. When Rall's own engineers came to him and said, "Sir, we should fortify this town, build defensive walls, set up redoubts, prepare positions," Rall waved them away. When they showed him their plans, actual detailed drawings of fortifications that could protect Trenton, Rall dismissed them. He reportedly said, "Let them come. We will go at them with the bayonet." Bold words, but words that left his men completely exposed. No fortifications, no defensive positions, no serious outpost system. The Hessians were essentially sitting in an open town, assuming that no one would be crazy enough to attack them. And the warnings kept coming. Loyalists, Americans who remained loyal to the British crown, came to Trenton and told Rall that the rebels were planning something. American deserters crossed over and told the Hessians that rations were being prepared for an advance. Rall's own superiors sent word to be on your guard. In his own private letters, Rall admitted he was worried about an attack. He wrote to his superiors that Trenton was indefensible and asked for additional troops to be stationed nearby. His request was denied, and publicly he kept up the facade of confidence. He dismissed the warnings. He told his men there was nothing to fear. He was wrong on a scale that history rarely forgives. There is also the story of a spy, one of the most fascinating and least told chapters of the Battle of Trenton. Washington had placed a man named John Honeyman in Trenton months before the battle. Honeyman posed as a Tory, a British loyalist, and worked as a butcher and bartender, trading with the British and Hessian forces. This gave him access to their conversations, their movements, their plans. And more importantly, it gave him the ability to whisper in the Hessians' ear that the Continental Army was in terrible shape, that Washington's men were too cold, too demoralized, too broken to ever mount a serious attack. Honeyman helped lull the Hessians into a false sense of security. And then, just before Christmas, Honeyman arranged to be captured by American soldiers and brought to Washington. He gave the general a full intelligence briefing, the positions of the Hessian regiments, the layout of the town, the locations of the pickets, the attitude of the men. And then Honeyman conveniently escaped from custody and made his way back to Trenton, where no one suspected a thing. It was a spy operation worthy of a Hollywood film, and it gave Washington exactly what he needed to plan his attack. So on Christmas Day, 1776, while Washington was quietly putting his plan into motion on the Pennsylvania side of the river, what was happening in Trenton? Colonel Rahl was celebrating Christmas at the home of a wealthy merchant named Abraham Hunt. He was eating, drinking, and playing cards. His men were celebrating as best they could. Some were tired from weeks of harassment by American militia, small raids that had been keeping the Hessians on edge for weeks. The men hadn't had a proper night's sleep in some time because of those raids. But on Christmas night, with the terrible weather outside, a snowstorm was building. No one felt like there was any reason to worry. Who would attack in this weather? Who would be crazy enough to cross that river tonight? As darkness fell on December 25th, Washington's army assembled on the Pennsylvania banks of the Delaware River. What Washington saw when he looked at these men could have broken a lesser leader. Their uniforms, those of them who still had uniforms, were in tatters. Many had no shoes. Their feet were wrapped in cloth and rags. Some had bloody feet from days and weeks of marching on frozen ground. They were hungry. Some were sick. Many were barely strong enough to stand, let alone cross a river and march through the night. But they stood there, ready, because Washington had asked them to be, and because Thomas Paine's words were still ringing in their ears. These are the times that try men's souls. This was that time. They were those souls. Washington's plan was elegant in its ambition and terrifyingly complex in its execution. He wanted to strike Trenton from 3 directions simultaneously. The main force, around 2,400 men under his direct command, would cross the Delaware about 9 miles north of Trenton at a place called McConkey's Ferry, then march south through the night, split into 2 columns, and attack the town from the north and the west at the same time. A second force under General James Ewing would cross the river directly at Trenton and seize the bridge over Assunpink Creek to cut off any Hessian escape to the south. A third force under General John Cadwalader would cross further south and launch a diversionary attack on another British garrison, preventing reinforcements from arriving. 3 coordinated strikes. Perfect trap. At least that was the theory. Before his army left camp, a visitor arrived. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a famous physician and revolutionary leader, came to wish Washington well. While he was there, he happened to glance at a piece of paper on Washington's desk. On it, Washington had written just 2 words. Those words would become the password for the entire operation. Those words were, victory or death. Not good luck. Not Godspeed. Victory or death. Washington was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it in every literal sense. This attack had to succeed, because failure now meant the end of everything. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, Washington's 2,400 men began making their way to the river's edge. The boats they would use were called Durham boats, long, flat-bottomed iron or barges that could carry heavy loads. They were about 60 feet long and 8 feet wide. The men who handled them were Colonel John Glover's regiment from Marblehead, Massachusetts, fishermen and sailors who knew how to manage boats in difficult water. And the water that night was about as difficult as water gets. The Delaware River was filled with enormous chunks of floating ice, massive, jagged slabs grinding against each other in the dark current. The wind was howling. A nor'easter, one of the most powerful types of winter storms on the East Coast, was building. Rain began to fall, then turned to sleet, then to snow. The temperature kept dropping. The crossing that was supposed to be completed by midnight was nowhere near finished by midnight. The boats moved slowly, fighting the current and the ice. Men fell in the water. One officer, Colonel John Haslett, went overboard completely but was quickly pulled out. The horses and the cannon, 18 artillery pieces that Henry Knox had insisted on bringing, had to be loaded onto large ferries separately, a slow and dangerous process. Through all of it, Washington was present, moving between the men, encouraging, directing, refusing to let the chaos become panic. By the time the last of Washington's 2,400 men had crossed to the New Jersey side, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 hours behind schedule. The plan had called for a pre-dawn attack, arriving at Trenton in the dark before first light, so the element of surprise would be complete. That window was now gone. Dawn was only a few hours away. Washington gathered his officers, who quietly told him that 2 of the 3 columns, Ewing's and Cadwallader's forces, had been unable to complete their crossings because of the weather. They had turned back. They weren't coming. The three-pronged attack was now a single-pronged attack. Washington's 2,400 men, alone, exhausted, hours behind schedule, would have to do the job that three forces were supposed to do together. Washington looked at his officers. He looked at his men. He looked at the storm raging around him. And he made his decision. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are going forward. There would be no turning back. Not after everything they had been through. Not after the Delaware crossing. Not after all the defeats of the past year. Not after the blood those men had left on the ice. They were going forward." At 4 o'clock in the morning, the march to Trenton began. 9 miles in the dark. 9 miles in a snowstorm. 9 miles with feet that were bleeding and bodies that were at the edge of their limits. The road was icy and slick. The wind blew straight into their faces. But they marched. Washington rode on horseback along the line, moving back and forth, urging the men forward. "Keep up with the man in front of you. Keep moving. Don't stop." He rode beside struggling soldiers, grabbed the arm of men who were starting to falter, and refused to let his army slow down. At some point during that march, a message came forward from General Sullivan's column, the men approaching from the south. Sullivan's aide-de-camp rode up to Washington and reported that the snow and sleet had soaked through the men's cartridge boxes, wetting the gunpowder. Many of the muskets might not fire. It was a potentially catastrophic problem. Without working muskets, the attack would be in serious trouble. Washington's response was immediate and absolute. "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton. No hesitation. No fear. No going back. Use the bayonet." As the army marched, the temperature was so low and the storm so fierce that 2 soldiers died during that 9-mile march. Not from enemy fire, not from battle wounds, but from the cold. Just from the sheer brutal cold of a December night in New Jersey. Their names are largely forgotten by history. They are part of the long list of unsung heroes who gave everything they had for a country that was still just a dream, for a freedom that they would never live to enjoy. They are part of what makes that night so powerful, so moving, so important. About 2 miles outside of Trenton, Washington's main columns unexpectedly encountered 50 armed men in the darkness. For one heart-stopping moment, everyone thought it might be Hessian scouts. It wasn't. They were Americans, a detachment under General Adam Stephen that had, completely unaware of Washington's plan, launched its own small raid on a Hessian outpost earlier that night. Washington was furious. If the Hessians had been alerted by Stephen's raid, the entire element of surprise was gone. He rode to Stephen and reportedly shouted, you, sir, may have ruined all my plans." But it turned out, in a stroke of luck that the exhausted, frozen Americans badly needed, that Rahl had received word of the small raid and had concluded that it was the attack his superiors had warned him about. He assumed there would be no further action that night. He went back to his party. He went back to his cards and his Christmas celebration. And he went to sleep. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the New Jersey horizon on the morning of December 26, 1776, Washington's army approached the outskirts of Trenton. It was approximately 8 o'clock in the morning. Much later than planned. Much later than ideal. But here they were. They were here and they were ready. Washington divided his force into 2 attacking columns, exactly as planned. General Nathaniel Greene, one of the most capable officers in the Continental Army, would take his column north and swing around to attack Trenton from the north, coming down the Pennington Road. General John Sullivan would lead his column in from the west along the River Road. Henry Knox's artillery would be positioned at the top of King Street and Queen Street, the 2 main roads running through the center of town, to catch the Hessians in the open. At a Hessian outpost on the Pennington Road about a mile northwest of Trenton, a lieutenant named Andreas Wiederholt stepped out of a cooper's shop into the cold morning air. An American soldier fired at him and missed. Wiederholt shouted in German, Der Feind, heraus! The enemy, get out!" He grabbed his men and they returned fire. Washington personally led the charge on that outpost, riding at the front of his soldiers. The Americans fired 3 volleys. The Hessians fired back once. And then the Hessian outpost began to fall back toward town, their organized retreat becoming more desperate as they realized this was no small raiding party. This was an army. The sound of gunfire reaching Trenton was the alarm. Inside the town, the 3 Hessian regiments scrambled to form up. Colonel Rahl was dragged from his sleep, or from wherever he had passed out after the Christmas festivities, and rushed to assess the situation. What he found was chaos. His men were running in the streets, trying to find their positions, trying to load their muskets in the cold and the wind and the snow. And coming at them from the north and west were 2 columns of determined American soldiers who had survived a night that should have killed them. Washington's artillery, those 18 cannon that Henry Knox had dragged across the ice-choked Delaware River through the storm, that his men had hauled through 9 miles of frozen roads, now came into their terrible and decisive purpose. Positioned at the heads of the 2 main streets, Knox's guns opened fire with grapeshot and cannonballs. Grapeshot, clusters of small iron balls fired from a cannon, is a devastating weapon in an urban setting. It tears through formations of men like a shotgun blast. And it tore through the Hessian formations on King Street and Queen Street with horrifying effectiveness. Rahl tried to organize a counterattack. He brought up 2 of his own 3-pound cannon and tried to clear the American artillery. But American fire cut down his gun crews almost immediately. Half the men working the Hessian cannon were killed in minutes. The Hessian cannon fired 6 rounds each and fell silent. And then American soldiers rushed forward and seized those cannon, turned them around and pointed them back at the Hessians. Rahl's own guns were now being used against him. All through the town the battle raged. American soldiers fought from house to house, using buildings for cover. Hessian soldiers tried to form ranks in the streets but were cut down by artillery. Sullivan's column pushed in from the west and south, seizing the bridge over Assunpink Creek, cutting off the Hessians' escape route. American soldiers from both columns pushed deeper and deeper into the town, systematically overwhelming every position of resistance. Rahl, watching his men falling back in disorder, made one final desperate attempt to turn the tide. He rallied what remained of his Rahl and Lossberg regiments, pulling them together in a field at the edge of town. The brigade's band struck up martial music, fifes and drums and bugles, trying to rally the men's spirits, trying to put some fight back into soldiers who were watching their world collapse around them. And Rahl rode at their head, sword drawn, shouting, "Forward! Advance! Advance!" They moved toward the northern heights, trying to outflank the American position. Washington saw them coming. He was on high ground, commanding the whole battle with a clarity and calm that seemed almost supernatural given the chaos around him. He immediately repositioned his troops to meet the Hessian counterattack. And what happened next was almost merciful in its swiftness. The 2 Hessian regiments, marching toward King Street, were caught in a crossfire from 3 directions. Musket fire from the left, musket fire from the right, and Henry Knox's cannon firing directly into their front. The formations disintegrated. Men fell. Men ran. The discipline that had made the Hessians so feared collapsed under the relentless American pressure. And then Colonel Rahl was hit. 2 bullets struck him, 1 in each side. He lurched in the saddle. His men caught him before he fell and carried him back from the front. The Hessians, seeing their commander fall, lost whatever remained of their fighting spirit. Their formations broke apart completely. The men who could still move began retreating into an orchard at the edge of town. And Washington's men followed them, surrounded, cut off. With no escape route available and no more fight left in them, the Hessians raised their hands in surrender. The Kniphausen Regiment, the 3rd Hessian Regiment, had been separated from the others during the fighting and tried to escape south across the Assunpink Creek Bridge. They found it blocked by Sullivan's men. They turned and tried to break through the American lines. They couldn't. They surrendered just minutes after the rest of the garrison. The battle was over. In just 90 minutes from the first shots fired to the final Hessian surrender, Washington's exhausted, frozen, half-starved Continental Army had destroyed one of the most feared garrisons in the British force. They had done the impossible, and they knew it. When Rahl was brought to Washington, wounded, pale, barely conscious, Washington received him with the dignity that a defeated commander deserves. He reportedly shook Rawls' hand. He ordered that the Hessian colonel receive the best available medical care. It didn't matter. Rawls' wounds were too severe. He died that night, December 26, 1776, at his own headquarters in Trenton. When they examined him after death, some accounts say they found in his coat pocket an unread note that had been delivered to him the previous night, warning him that Washington was coming. Whether that story is completely accurate or somewhat embellished by later historians is debated. But what is not debated is this: Rawls never took the threat seriously enough. And that cost him his life and his command. As Washington surveyed the aftermath, the numbers told a story that seemed almost impossible. The Hessians had suffered approximately 22 killed, 83 wounded, and somewhere between 800 and 900 captured, including all 4 of their senior colonels. The Americans had lost only 5 men wounded in actual combat, including a young officer named James Monroe, who took a bullet in the shoulder and nearly bled to death before a quick-thinking surgeon saved his life. James Monroe would go on to become the 5th President of the United States. Just 2 Americans died during the entire operation, both of them during the nighttime march from exposure to the cold. And it wasn't just the men they captured. The Americans seized everything the Hessian garrison had stored for the winter. Tons of flour, dried and salted meats, ale, rum, ammunition, muskets, cannon, horses, clothing, boots, and blankets. For soldiers who had been freezing and starving for months, those supplies were almost as valuable as the military victory itself. Men who had been marching with bare feet were suddenly pulling on Hessian boots. Soldiers who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days were eating Hessian rations. It was, in every practical sense, a life-saving haul. After the surrender, Washington turned to a young officer nearby, shook his hand, and said the words that would echo through American history: "This is a glorious day for our country." And then the question became, what next? Washington had won an extraordinary victory, but he was also painfully aware of how isolated his position now was. His 2 supporting columns had never made it across the river. He was in Trenton with 2,400 tired soldiers, almost 1,000 Hessian prisoners, and no backup. He couldn't risk staying. By midday, he had marched his army, prisoners and captured supplies in tow, back across the Delaware and into Pennsylvania. The battle was over, but what it had set in motion was just beginning. The news traveled fast. Within days, people all across the colonies were talking about what had happened at Trenton on the morning of December 26th. George Washington, the general everyone had been writing off, the commander who seemed to lose every battle he fought, had crossed an ice-choked river in a blizzard on Christmas night, marched 9 miles through the dark and the cold, and destroyed a garrison of professional German soldiers in 90 minutes with almost no casualties. It was the kind of story that people didn't quite believe when they first heard it. And then they heard it again, and again. And something happened in the hearts of Americans all across the 13 colonies. Something that had been slowly dying came back to life. Hope. The Continental Congress, which had been in near panic for months. Some members had actually fled Philadelphia fearing the British would march in, found new confidence. The governors of the various colonies began pushing harder for recruits and supplies. And most critically, Washington's own soldiers, the men whose enlistments were expiring on December 31st, chose to stay. When Washington asked them, each regiment in turn, to extend their service for just one more month, they said yes. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to keep the army alive. Enough to continue the fight. New recruits began showing up at the Continental Army's camps. Young men who had been on the fence, who had been watching the war from a distance, waiting to see which way it would go, now made their decision. They showed up with their muskets and their enthusiasm and their willingness to serve. Trenton hadn't just won a battle. It had won something that no battle alone can win. It had won hearts and minds. It had reminded people what they were fighting for and convinced them that it was actually possible to win. Washington wasn't done. Just a week after Trenton, he crossed the Delaware again, leading his army back into New Jersey. On January 2, 1777, he fought and won the Battle of Assunpink Creek, holding off a British counterattack in a brilliant defensive action. And then, in one of the most audacious moves of the entire war, He slipped away from the British force in the night and marched his army to Princeton. On January 3, 1777, just 8 days after the Battle of Trenton, Washington struck the British garrison at Princeton and won another stunning victory. Washington himself rode to the front of his troops when the battle was in danger of going badly, galloping into the fire on his white horse and rallying the men around him. The British were defeated again. The 10 crucial days, that extraordinary 10-day period from December 26, 1776 to January 3, 1777, had turned the entire momentum of the American Revolution. After Princeton, the British pulled back. General Howe, who had been so confident just weeks earlier that the rebellion was essentially finished, now found himself watching his forces retreat across most of New Jersey. The territory that the British had swept through so easily in the fall of 1776 was being reclaimed by Washington's resurgent army. The war was far from over. It would continue for 6 more years, through the terrible winter of Valley Forge, through the battles of Brandywine and Germantown and Monmouth, through the slow, grinding attrition of a seemingly endless conflict. But it would no longer be a war that anyone believed the Americans were about to lose. That shift, that fundamental change in the perception of who might actually win this war, began at Trenton. And there is one more consequence of Trenton that cannot be overstated. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the palaces and courts of Europe, people were paying attention. France, Britain's ancient rival, had been watching the American Revolution with great interest. French leaders knew that if America won its independence, it would be a massive blow to British power and prestige. But the French were not going to commit their money and their military to a cause that was clearly losing. After the disasters of 1776, France had all but given up on the American rebels. Trenton and Princeton changed the calculation entirely. Here was an army, led by a general of genuine genius, that could not only survive impossible odds but turn them around. The French began to take the Americans seriously again. And in 1778, France formally entered the war as an American ally, sending money, weapons, ships, and soldiers. Without French support, the American Revolution almost certainly would have ended in defeat. And the seed of that French decision was planted in the snow-covered streets of Trenton on the morning of December 26, 1776. Now let's talk about the men who actually fought that battle. The 2,400 soldiers who crossed the Delaware that night are not faceless figures in history books. They were real people. They had families. They had farms. They had whole lives waiting for them at home. They had every reason in the world to stay on the Pennsylvania side of that river. And they crossed anyway. They were farmers from Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. They were blacksmiths and carpenters and merchants. They were young men barely old enough to shave and older men who should have been home by a warm fire. They were, in every sense, ordinary people doing something that was anything but ordinary. Some of them left letters and diaries, and those writings are among the most powerful documents of the Revolutionary period. One soldier wrote of that night that it was as severe a night as ever I saw, describing the frost, the wind, the ice, the impossible cold. Another wrote that many of the men had no shoes, and their feet left bloody marks on the snow. One officer noted that as they marched, Washington rode beside them, moving up and down the column, encouraging every man he passed. Not from a safe distance, not behind the lines, alongside them, in the same cold, in the same storm, leading from the front in the most literal possible sense. 2 men died in that storm. Their names are not widely remembered. History tends to remember the generals and the politicians. But those 2 men, who froze to death on a 9-mile march through a New Jersey snowstorm before they even reached the battlefield, gave the ultimate sacrifice for a country that didn't even fully exist yet. They are part of what America is. They are part of why America exists. The women, too, deserve their place in this story. The wives and mothers and daughters left at home while their men marched and fought and sometimes never came back. The women who managed farms and businesses alone. The women who nursed wounded soldiers back to health. The women who scraped together food and clothing for the Continental Army when Congress couldn't. The women who kept the home fires burning through years of war and uncertainty. The American Revolution was not won by men alone. It was held together by an entire society that refused to give up. And then there is the story that gets told every time this battle is discussed, the famous painting. In 1851, a German-American artist named Emanuel Leutze painted Washington crossing the Delaware. You have almost certainly seen it. It is enormous, 12 feet tall, 21 feet wide. It shows Washington standing upright in the bow of a Durham boat, surrounded by his struggling soldiers, crossing an ice-filled river in the dark and the storm. He is erect. He is calm. He is looking forward, always forward, toward the New Jersey shore, toward Trenton, toward victory. The painting is not entirely historically accurate. Washington almost certainly didn't stand in the boat like that. It would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The boats in the painting are the wrong type. Some of the details are off. But the spirit of the painting, the feeling it captures, is exactly right. Captures the determination, the refusal to quit, the forward-looking courage of a man and an army that had every reason to stop and somehow found every reason to continue. Leutze painted it in 1851, during a period of great political upheaval in Europe. He was inspired by the liberal revolutions of 1848 that had swept across Germany and France, and he wanted to create a work of art that would remind the world what a revolution made of real principle could accomplish. He wanted people to look at Washington, standing in that boat, defying the cold and the storm and the impossible odds, and believe that they could do the same. That painting has hung in museums and schoolrooms and government buildings for over 170 years. It has been copied and referenced and parroted and reimagined thousands of times. And every time someone looks at it, they are looking at the essential truth of what happened on Christmas night, 1776. A man who refused to lose, an army that refused to quit, a revolution that refused to die. What does the Battle of Trenton teach us? What lessons, across more than 240 years, still speak to us today? The first lesson is perhaps the most fundamental. The most important battles are fought when everything seems most hopeless. Washington had been losing all year. His army was dissolving around him. His country was on the verge of collapse. And it was precisely at that moment, the darkest, most desperate moment, that he found the courage to act. Not to wait for conditions to improve. Not to hope that something would change. But to make the change himself. To act. To move. To cross the river. The second lesson is about the danger of underestimating your enemy. Colonel Rahl was a veteran soldier with 36 years of experience. He had fought in major European campaigns. He commanded disciplined, professional troops. And he was destroyed by men he considered beneath his notice. He did not build defenses because he didn't think he needed them. He ignored warnings because he didn't believe the Americans were capable of following through. He paid for that arrogance with his life. In war, in business, in life, the moment you stop taking the opposition seriously is the moment you become vulnerable. The third lesson is about leadership and its relationship to sacrifice. Washington didn't issue orders from a warm headquarters. He was on that river. He was in that storm. He marched those 9 miles in the same cold and the same dark as his soldiers. He rode alongside them, encouraging them. He galloped to the front when the fighting was thickest. Great leadership, real leadership, is not about giving orders. It is about being present, being willing to share the burden, being the first one to step into the cold. The fourth lesson is about the power of one decisive moment. Trenton did not win the American Revolution by itself. There were years of hard fighting still ahead. But Trenton changed the trajectory of the entire war. It restored confidence when confidence had been destroyed. It renewed enlistments when the army was about to dissolve. It impressed foreign powers who had been about to write America off. It was one battle, 90 minutes of fighting, that rippled outward through years and decades of consequence. Sometimes one moment, one decision, one act of extraordinary courage at exactly the right time is enough to change everything. And the fifth lesson, perhaps the deepest one, is about the meaning of sacrifice. Every man who crossed that river on Christmas night did so voluntarily. Every man who marched those 9 miles in the dark and the cold made a choice. They could have stayed. They could have gone home. Their enlistments were almost up. They owed nothing more. But they stayed. They crossed. They marched. because they believed in something larger than themselves, because they believed that freedom, genuine human freedom, was worth suffering for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for in a snowstorm in New Jersey before you even reached the battlefield. America was not born on July 4, 1776. That was the day the words were written. America was born on December 26, 1776, on the streets of Trenton, New Jersey, where an army of ordinary people did something extraordinary and proved to the world and to themselves that the dream was real, that the sacrifice was worth it, and that they were capable of seeing it through. The Hessians were shipped to Philadelphia and then to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and eventually to Virginia as prisoners of war. Most of them, in a fascinating footnote to history, never went back to Germany. After the war ended, they settled in America, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in Virginia, and became American citizens. The very soldiers who had come to crush the American Revolution ended up becoming Americans themselves. History has a sense of humor. General Rahl died in his headquarters on the night of December 26, 1776. He was buried in a churchyard in Trenton. He was, by most accounts, a brave man who made fatally bad decisions. He underestimated his enemy, neglected his defenses, and paid the ultimate price. Whatever else history says about him, he died as a soldier. Washington, to his credit, never spoke of him with contempt. He treated the Hessian prisoners, including the wounded Rahl, with the dignity that captured soldiers deserve. Young James Monroe, the future 5th President of the United States, spent months recovering from his shoulder wound. He was 18 years old on the morning of the Battle of Trenton. He survived. He thrived. He went on to serve his country for decades, becoming a governor, a senator, a secretary of state, and finally president. Every time you look at a portrait of James Monroe, the serious, dignified face, the formal presidential posture, remember that the man in that portrait once lay bleeding in the snow on a New Jersey street, his shoulder torn open by a Hessian musket ball, saved from death by a surgeon who got to him just in time. Today, you can visit Washington Crossing Historic Park in Pennsylvania, the place where Washington and his army launched their crossing of the Delaware. Every year, on December 25th, volunteers reenact the crossing. Men in Revolutionary-era costumes climb into boats and push out into the Delaware River, just as their predecessors did on that desperate Christmas night. It is cold. It is often snowy. The river is dark and the current is strong. And for a few hours every year, the memory of what happened there comes alive again. Because some things deserve to be remembered. Some things demand to be remembered. In Trenton itself, you can visit the old barracks museum, the actual Hessian barracks from 1776, still standing after 250 years. You can walk the streets where the battle was fought. You can see the ground where Rahl's cannon were seized and turned against his own men. You can stand where Washington stood and look out over the town and imagine what he saw in the gray dawn of December 26, 1776. And if you stand there long enough and think about it hard enough, you might begin to understand what it felt like to be there. To be exhausted and cold and afraid and determined all at once. To know that the future of your country, the very idea of your country, was hanging in the balance. And to decide in that moment to go forward anyway. That is the Battle of Trenton. That is the night march that saved the American Revolution. That is the story of what human beings can do when they refuse, absolutely refuse, to accept defeat. It is a story about geography and strategy and military tactics, yes. But underneath all of that, it is a story about something much simpler and much more powerful than any of those things. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people, pushed to the absolute limit of what they can endure, discover that they have more inside them than they ever imagined. When the cold is unbearable and the darkness is complete and the odds are impossible, and they go forward anyway. George Washington once said, and these words apply not just to that Christmas night, but to every moment in American history where the cause seemed lost. He said, "Perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages. Perseverance and spirit. That is what crossed the Delaware on the night of December 25, 1776. That is what marched 9 miles through the snow and the cold and the dark. That is what swept through the streets of Trenton in the gray dawn and destroyed a professional army in 90 minutes. Not superior numbers. Not superior weapons. Not superior training. Perseverance and spirit. And that, if you take nothing else from this story, is the legacy of Trenton. That the human spirit, when it is fully and genuinely committed to something worth fighting for, is the most powerful force in the world. More powerful than cold. More powerful than distance. More powerful than fear. More powerful than professional armies and rented soldiers and the might of the British Empire. Perseverance and spirit. They have done wonders in all ages. And on the morning of December 26, 1776, in the snow-covered streets of a small town in New Jersey, they did wonders again. This has been the story of the Battle of Trenton, the night march that saved the American Revolution. Thank you for being here with the Historic America, where every story we tell is a story worth remembering.